that I wear is director of the Wildland Research Institute at the University of Leeds, and I'm on the organising committee for Wild 12, so the World Wilderness Congress, which is in August in Dakota this year. So it falls to me to just introduce some of the guiding principles of rewilding, what it is and perhaps what it isn't. So in 2021, we had a paper which came out in Conservation Biology, which was the end of a very long process, took a couple of years, where IUCN CEM asked Ian and then myself and a core group of people to pin down what rewilding really means in a IUCN context and come up with a set of guiding principles for rewilding. I mean, I'm not going to give you the definition that we came up with here because it's quite long-winded, but I always like to say that, in simple terms, rewilding is giving nature the space and the time to dictate its own ecological trajectories with no defined endpoint. And of course, that might require an element of intervention to begin with to kickstart processes. But at the end of the day, it's nature-driven or nature-led ecosystems. We'll come back to that at the end of my short presentation in reference to why we think perhaps that rewilding is different from ecological restoration. So we went through this process of deciding what rewilding is through a series of workshops and a series of questionnaires with over 120 invited key participants, and then a series of institutes, and came up with that definition and a set of guiding principles. I'm going to go through the guiding principles briefly in a minute, but Ian and I quite often like to start these things with, what rewilding isn't. Because there's a lot of people jump on the rewilding bandwagon, or they have a knee-jerk reaction, which is somewhat anti-rewilding, and accuse rewilders of doing all sorts of things. But rewilding isn't, despite the re-bit, and I never did like the word rewilding because of the implications of it going back to something. It isn't trying to recreate ecosystems for thousands of years ago. Yes, the past always informs the future, but it's very much a forward-looking approach. So looking at future, what we might call future natural. It isn't also about rewilding everywhere. Sorry. I like my food and my beer as much as the next person, and we need land to grow food, or we do at the moment anyway, and important commodities like timber, etc. So it's really about rewilding where possible and where appropriate. And so on that point, it's not anti-farming. So a lot of the farming community are very anti-rewilding because they see it as somehow against their industry and their livelihoods. It's not anti-people either. So rewilding nature and is obviously part of that definition, but it's also about rewilding ourselves and how those two things go hand in hand. And particularly in small isolated island countries like the UK, it's not just about bringing back predators such as wolves and bear. Yes, that species reintroductions are an important rewilding tool, but this is always, and I always say, it's always incredibly context specific, but it needs to be driven by the science and ecosystem function. And of course, I'm now going to kind of go through that kind of slightly sequential, dull kind of, this is what the rewilding principles are, but you'll see elements of these coming through. So after that process of a series of international workshops in the USA, in the UK, and in Europe, and one in South Africa, we snowballed and redefined and wordsmithed a set of rewilding principles, and there are 10 in the list. The last one is not so much a principle, rather a sort of a paradigm, if you like. But nonetheless, I think it makes sense to go through these before handing it over to Jonathan and to Alex, who'll say something a bit more specific and context relevant. But just to go through, if you're not familiar with these, what the rewilding principles that we wrote down in that guiding principles paper in conservation biology are. And there's an order to them. So we start off with the baseline ecological principles underpinning rewilding, and then we move on to the social and more overarching paradigm aspect. So our first principle was that rewilding utilizes wildlife to restore trophic interactions. This is a key thing about rewilding, let's say, above ecological restoration. It's we're using trophic systems, trophic interactions, reinforced by apex predators and keystone species where appropriate, to reintroduce those missing processes, those missing links, those missing interactions. The second principle says that rewilding employs landscape scale planning with core areas, connectivity, and coexistence. And so you're probably familiar with the cores, corridors, and carnivores model that was initially developed in the North American model of rewilding. And of course, these principles that we're discussing here attempt to come up with a global set of principles, which we acknowledge will need to be modified and adjusted to suit local specific context. So rewilding employs landscape scale planning. So these core areas, protected areas with connectivity for free movement between them. And coexistence is an important fourth C, if you like, that we need as humans to learn to live with keystone species in integrated landscapes. The third principle focuses on recovery of ecological processes, interactions, and conditions, based on these reference ecosystems, so the rebit of the rewilding, if you like, looking at existing intact ecosystems and seeing how these can be re-established, and not going back in time, but forwards. So using appropriate ecological references, models based on historical records, scientific and/or indeed local indigenous knowledge, basic stuff really in a way, but needs saying. And the fourth of these ecological principles is that rewilding recognizes that ecosystems are dynamic and constantly changing. I often say that the only constant in landscapes is change itself. And of course, ecosystems are dynamic, and we need to provide them with the space and the connectivity needed for that temporal change of processes. And that might include both allergenic and autogenic drivers, external drivers such as storms, floods, climate change, and autogenic, those internal nutrient cycles, energy flows, etc. The fifth kind of takes a bit of a phase shift, and we've been talking about ecological processes and interactions and species and things in the first four, but now we're actually recognizing that one of those allergenic processes is really important here, and that is climate change. Whether that's human-forced climate change or those are some of those underlying natural patterns, but we need to take that into account when planning for rewilding. And rewilding can be seen as a nature-based solution to mitigate some of the worst effects of climate change. It's never going to solve the problem, but it can be used to increase resilience, landscape scale resilience, with reforestation, peatland restoration, etc. We're now sort of shifting towards those more social aspects. So rewilding requires local engagement and support. So if local people, businesses, stakeholders are not up for a rewilding project, it's not going to happen. So it needs to bring people along, be inclusive, local consultation with participatory planning. And you see that in the Kunming Montreal targets. Number one, it's about participatory approaches. Target number two is about ecological restoration for degraded landscapes. So this will encourage public understanding of wild nature. Number 7 says it's informed, going back to previous one, it's sort of linking back to number 4 about rewilding being informed by science, traditional science, but also indigenous and local knowledge. So that practitioner, researcher, indigenous, local knowledge collaborations will inform rewilding within these adaptive management frameworks. Number 8 is an interesting one. We recognize the intrinsic value of all species. there's an ethical responsibility for us to acknowledge that wild species have a place in the world, and we can't always be at the top of that biotic pyramid. So it's more of an ecocentric rather than an anthropocentric approach. Rewilding adaptive and dependent on monitoring and feedback, so kind of the science again, that we need to basically keep an eye on what's going on, but allow nature the space and the time to dictate its own trajectories. So natura naturans, as we say in the definition. And then finally, that 10th is kind of not really strictly a principle. It's more of a sort of a pointing towards a paradigm shift. And so rewilding offers or provides us with an opportunity for a paradigm shift in the coexistence of humans and nature. So we need to be more aware of the importance of global ecosystems for all life on the planet, not just us. It's not all about us. It's about every living being. And shift ecological baselines towards healthy, fully functioning trophic ecosystems instead of this constant, downgrading of ecosystems, over, human lifetimes and memories, whereby overexploitation becomes the norm. So that's a quick run through the 10 principles. Obviously, in the paper, they're expanded on in more detail with references supplied, but that's a quick run through those 10 principles. And if there's a diagram which underpins that, it's this continuum diagram that we borrowed from Rob Leslie's work, looking at a wilderness continuum. But rewilding ambition occupies some middle ground between, those human-modified landscapes and the wilderness landscapes, which we just want to protect and not mess with, really. So rewilding is trying to move us towards the right-hand end of that spectrum in whatever context, whether that's small-scale nature development or whether it's large-scale 3Cs rewilding. So we're all familiar with that 3Cs model. We've kind of created a new 3Cs model, time for a more optimistic approach to restoring nature. So we've still got the cores and the connectivity, so the cores and corridors, but the carnivores bit is really kind of transmodified into coexistence, and you see in that Venn diagram there, the overlap between those three circles are really quite important. And just to finish off, I said at the beginning that rewilding is different from restoration, ecological restoration. Ecological restoration is human-led, nature-enabled. So it's us calling the shots and using nature-based systems and the services to achieve a desired endpoint in a landscape. Rewilding is different. Rewilding is nature-led, human-enabled. So it's nature calling the shots. It's just us allowing it the space and the time to do that. And that's the end of my short presentation. So I'll hand you over to Alex and Jonathan.
Thanks, Steve. Just before you guys start, Alex and Jonathan, if you have got any questions or any thoughts, just drop them in the chat and I'll sort of pull them together for the discussion at the end of the session. Over to you guys.
Can you see those slides okay? Thanks, Steve. Okay. Yeah, I suppose in a way, maybe the nicest way to kind of connect into what Steve's been talking about is this idea of the baseline, how in a way, one of the issues that's repeatedly been discussed in the context of rewilding and the challenge of kind of maintaining biodiversity and addressing biodiversity loss is this idea of shifting baselines and how unaware we often are of how much things have changed, in previous generations, or relative to previous generations. And I suppose, in some ways that was one of the ideas behind this map of naturalness potential that I'm going to present now, which was to kind of make a snapshot of what landscape looks like in terms of naturalness in France, and have that available as a decision support tool going forward. So this map was produced, it's a kind of collaboration. So Steve's name is not on here, but it should be on here. But it's a collaboration between, sorry, Steve, between me, myself, Steve, and Adrien Guettet in France. And it emerged out of a series of discussions around 10 years ago with the CEM France wilderness thematic group, or what do they call it, wilderness and nature ferale. Yeah, I'll save the definitions for Alexandra to go into. And I mean, essentially, in some ways, the group spent many years kind of consulting different experts within France and abroad on what we might understand by wilderness in the French context, what we might understand by rewilding. And in some ways, the conclusion of all of those years of discussions was that maybe one useful way of forcing us towards a definition would be to try and spatially represent those definitions. And so it was decided that within the context of France, the idea of naturalness, the naturalness potential, or just, for short, the naturalness of the landscape was maybe a slightly more neutral term to begin with, that we might actually stand a chance of spatially representing over time. And in some ways, the relevance of that is as I was saying at the beginning, is that the hope is that by developing a standardized, robust, repeatable spatial method to map naturalness at the national scale in France, then that would give us the beginnings of a map tool that would allow us to understand how that idea of naturalness in the landscape changes over time. So in some ways, in its own kind of naive way, it gives us a baseline, and then because the method is repeatable, then we can repeat the exercise of mapping 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, and look at how the landscape is changing. And in some ways, as I'll show you now, that gives us an idea of potentially of some areas, of identifying areas that are rewilding. So the map itself is basically a combination of lots of different spatial data sets all combined together into 3 different groups, or facets, as they call them in French. The first spatial layer combines spatial data covering, it's kind of like land cover, what's occupying the soil. So it combines spatial data on forests and crops and all, various different kind of spatial components. And then they're then combined with historical data, historical mapping on France, dating back to the period of the 18th century and the 19th century, which identified areas that were forested in France at that time. And so the first component of the map is this idea of biophysical integrity. How intact in terms of naturalness is the landscape relative to what it would have been like before there was significant human pressure on the landscape. Then the second one tries to specifically capture the idea of human influence. So how intense is human pressure on the landscape at a given point in time? That data set, again, covers the whole of France and is built using a spatial layer which maps the density of buildings and the distance to different types of roads. And those data sets are in there as a proxy for human influence. And there's a lot of literature that shows that, accessibility of an area has a direct impact causally in terms of how ecologically intact that area is. So that's why that second layer was included. And then the third layer tries to kind of capture this idea of space, of sort of spatial temporal connectivity. So how, even though the analysis is done in a structural way, the idea is that this third group of spatial layers represents how well connected the landscape is. So what that third layer does is take the initial layer on biophysical integrity and then use a modeling tool called Omniscape to try and highlight those areas in the landscape which are highly natural and well connected to other areas that are also highly natural. The assumption being that those cores of high naturalness, go back to what Steve was talking about, and the corridors between them are important areas for the movement of species and have a functional importance in terms of biodiversity. And so we combined all those layers together for the whole of France. We worked with data sets that had full coverage for metropolitan France and fairly high resolution as well. So the map itself, even though it covers the whole of France, actually you can zoom all the way into pixels, like the pixels of the map are 20 meters by 20 meters across. So that map that we see on the right there, even though it looks, quite sort of fuzzy from a distance, it's actually made up of 1.4 billion spatial units. So the advantage of mapping in this way is that means that we have a kind of national perspective on naturalness that can be used to compare areas at the national scale, but you can also zoom into the regional scale in France and even the local scale and still produce meaningful results that you can actually walk through and recognize, the subtleties of the map coming through. So once you've got that map, what we've started to do with the map is kind of identify, in line with national targets in France and within Europe, identify those areas which are the most natural according to the map, and then compare that to areas in France which are currently strongly protected, as they call it in France, although at the European scale they talk about strict protection. So we began some initial analyses with the map, which I think actually is going to be submitted. I'm going to submit that today, Steve. You'll be happy to hear as well, the paper. So, but I'll give you a snapshot of that now. But we've produced some analyses which look at how the map performs in comparison to existing designations in France. And the argument for this is that obviously, if you produce a map at the national scale, you can't go out and ground truth it. We don't have millions of botanists who can wander around France telling us whether the map is accurately predicting naturalness in the landscape. So, but one thing we can do is we can compare how the map performs to areas which have been identified by ecologists and conservationists as areas that are important, and we can ask the question: does the map pick out areas? How does the map perform in comparison to those areas? Does it pick out those areas that are already protected? And if it does, then potentially it's useful to help us identify areas that haven't yet been protected. So within France, there's, as within Europe, there's the goal to reach this 10% of the terrestrial surface strictly protected, strongly protected. Sorry. But currently, the areas that are strongly protected in France only cover around 2 to 3% of the terrestrial area. So in order to identify new areas, we've been exploring the potential of this map as a way of doing that. So in a kind of more sort of hard science way, we've been analysing, as you see in this graph, how the map, the values for mapped naturalness correlate with areas that are strongly protected or just under a kind of standard protection or against like a random null model. And we have a significant we've basically been able to show that the map successfully predicts areas of strong protection as they currently are in France. We ran a similar analysis using, is that updating or not? What can you see now, Steve? Oh, it's a bit slow, isn't it? For some reason it's locked on mine.
Yeah, I can see your back to the potential naturalness versus IUCN category and null model there.
So you can see the IUCN categories. My screen's blank.
Yeah, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 box plots.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, we basically showed that for some reason my screen's blank. I don't know what's going on there. But we basically also successfully shown that the map accurately predicts areas that are classified as wild by the existing IUCN categories as well. I think what I might do is I might just stop sharing and reshare because it doesn't help if I can't actually see it.
If it continues, Jonathan, I can share my end, but let's see if you get it working again.
Yeah, I can see it now. It's fine. Thanks, Ian. And basically what we see here is that the map, the naturalness map is accurately identifying areas which are already considered to be of high importance in ecological terms or even potentially wild according to the IUCN categories. You can see that in 1A on the left there. The other thing we've done subsequently with the map is look at how it might be useful for understanding specific species movement. So there's some work underway here, which I'm snapshotting from Luis Morel, which is showing that the map is, if you were to classify mammal species or some insect or butterflies according to the degree to which they favour or avoid human-dominated landscapes, which we sometimes call a synanthropic index, the map is also accurately predicting where we would expect to find those species in the landscape. So we take data on species presence, species absence, and we've shown for butterflies, for mammals, and also we've got some work underway for birds as well at the moment, which we're just developing, which is showing that not only does the map kind of highlight areas that are important in terms of naturalness in a more sort of abstract way, it also actually seems to be successfully identifying areas which are important for species, according to their ecological attributes. The other way that we've been using the map is that in collaboration with some colleagues at the Botanical Research Institute in the Alps, the map was used as part of a decision-making process. So I was saying that in some ways, one of the advantages of these kind of national scale maps is that you can have a big picture perspective across a whole country, but you can also zoom into regions. So here we're seeing one of the regions of France, which is quite a large area. I'm not completely sure how big, but like hundreds of thousands of hectares in the southeast of France. In the PACA region, where Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur, where they've used the mapping as part of a decision-making process with other data, which is a bit patchier on biodiversity or species presence or taxonomic groups. And they've combined the map of naturalness with those other types of data to highlight areas which are possible search areas or possible new protected areas that could be strongly protected within that region. And those search areas are then taken to, local committees where people, local communities, but also local planners can review the suggestions which are emerging, and then they potentially can become protected areas in the future. So that's a process that's been underway in the last couple of years and is a sort of concrete implementation of the map. Finally, we've been looking just to kind of address specifically this idea of rewilding. We've been looking at how spatial data within France can be used to identify areas that were naturally rewilding. So these are often areas that are agricultural areas or industrial areas which have been abandoned. So we were using some data from Corin Landcover to produce this analysis of France, highlighting areas where change is happening. So this is kind of picking out areas that were formerly under intensive agricultural or industrial, but have since been abandoned. So that's one way in which we're planning to use this map going forward, is to carry on doing a similar kind of analysis, so that we have this kind of baseline snapshot of where naturalness was when we produced the map. So that's around 2018, and then we can begin, as we are doing now, to kind of rerun the map for a sort of delivery 2025, 2026. So we'll have a kind of snapshot of change underway. And again, that kind of information can be used to think about areas that might be worthy of protection that aren't currently protected. And so, yeah, maybe that's enough for me from now, because I'm probably slightly over time, having lost my slides. And maybe, maybe I can pass over to Alexandra now. And this idea of rewilding and how we define that in the French context.
Thank you. I will share my screen then. Here, can you see my screen? Perfect. Thank you. So I'm currently working at the French IUCN Committee, and I've done before that my PhD on wilderness strategy in Europe. And during this work, I showed that the use of certain terms around the notion of wilderness and rewilding in Europe depend on the socio-ecosystem and cultural context in which they are used. And this presentation is based in this work. And sorry for my bad English too. So the notion of wilderness is culturally constructed and associated with diversity of imaginaries and depend of mental universe, and has not equivalent in other language, especially in Latin language, such as French, Spanish, Italian. So this gasping of dimension beyond the notion of wilderness is particularly complex, especially outside English-speaking world, since transposing the notion into other language is difficult. For example, in French, the notion of sauvage, which can be translated by wild, is carrying a negative connotation. It's something dangerous. It has to be mastered, and it's opposed to the civilized. It's also associated with the predator present in the territory, wolf, lynx, bear, which cause conflict and fear. And we are in a context where the wolf come back by themselves, but a lot of people are thinking that it's ecologists who made them come back. So there is a lot of conflict around this topic. And it's also the fear of the return of a primitive state. And actually, the idea of sauvage can also be translated in English by savage. The notion of ensavagement, which is the process of making something wider, which could correspond to the wilding part of rewilding, is also charged with negative connotation, and it is also politicized, but in a bad way. For example, in 1950s, Aimé Césaire used the term ensauvagement to denounce colonization. And more recently, Gérald Darmanin in 2020, the Minister of the Interior, used the term ensauvagement to designate violence in the society. And the extreme right used the word to associate it with immigration. So it's really used in French in the political context and with a bad connotation. And then the notion of re-ensauvagement, which is rewilding, is also negatively connoted as the above, and it's also associated with the fear of a return of unwanted wild, like predators, the fear from territorial appropriation, because it's mostly people which are going from outside the territory, which are trying to implement that kind of project. And it's also the fear of the control use. You cannot doing what you want to do in this area since there is now rewilding. And it's also reinforcing the urban-rural tension, because mostly people which are leading project on rewilding or using the rewilding word, which is coming from the English, are coming from city and not living in the rural areas. So here are mostly the reasons, according to me and some research, why we don't really use rewilding or re-ensavagement in France. Instead, we are using the concept of free evolution, which is libre évolution. It appeared in the 1990s, and it's mainly associated with forest environments. We are a strong forest culture in France, sorry. And but it's also destined to be developed in all kinds of environments. The term is used by environmental and institutional managers, which helps to spread it. And the notion can cross with the objective of certain environmental management tools, as the senescent small plots that you can find in Natura 2000 tools, or in the National Office of Forest tools. And it also can designated areas that are de facto in this state of libre évolution, some space that are not accessible in forest or not exploited area, exploited area, sorry. And we also have a kind of particular relationship with the land ownership in France, because most of the forest area are private land. And then there is the work of the IUCN French Wilderness and Nature Feral Working Group. And this group has chosen the term of libre évolution and using also the term of naturalness with the map that Jonathan have just shown you. And they spreading these two words in the world of the management in France. And they decided to not use the rewilding term because it's associated with the return of large herbivores, according to them. In France, there are almost not projects claiming to be rewilding or coming from re-ensauvagement, apart from rewilding in France, which is quite new. And there is also some initiatives such as Rewilding Farm, which is Re-Ensauvager la Ferme, a project a bit like NEP Estate. And there is also a few books that are using those words, but that's it. So just to make you understand what is libre évolution, libre évolution is firstly a management principle, and it's a kind of critique of the interventionist and standardized nature management we have right now. And it's working about around a degree of freedom, which can vary according to the strategy implemented. It's an ethic idea because it's unfit to free ourselves, a bit like rewilding, and it's trying to change the representation of nature, and it's leading a new debate in nature conservation with the idea of intrinsic value of environment. And it's also a political approach because it's related to political decision guidelines, to question strategies that are currently taking place. And also it's linked, it's related to the timeline of the political agenda, which can be very different with the libre évolution. So finally, libre évolution is similar to the principle of passive rewilding or to self-wildland, but there is a lot of common points. There is also some differences. So here I will present you what are the common points. First, the libre évolution as rewilding are looking for natural process that can be considered along the continuum gradient as shown by Steve. They recognize the intrinsic value of species and environment. They're based on the commitment and recognition of local stakeholders and can also be used to mitigate climate change. The difference is mostly that libre évolution is not leading by a species approach, but by a habitat approach. It's just how the ecosystem will evolve without putting species into this area. And there is not spatial logic for like the core zone or the connectivity. It's not really taking into account here. It's mostly some small area which are not connected together for now. And recently, the concept was really put in the front of the stage with the Inter-Network seminar on libre évolution, which was this January. It was organized by the French Committee of the IUCN, but also the French Commission for the UNESCO and some environmental stakeholders. It was the first event to bring together manager and association working on that topic to dedicate an entire day about this subject. And it was also the first public electing of management initiative. So it was really important, and it highlights the willingness to develop link between networks and advance the free evolution concept. To show that at the end of the day, the president of the French IUCN Committee and the Secretary General of the French National Commission for the UNESCO ratified the following text, which marks the intention to make a lot of work in the direction of free evolution, and with the idea maybe to develop a label to recognize those areas, and maybe to use the man and biosphere system was one of the ideas we speak about. And then there is also the idea to develop a chair with the UNESCO and around the free evolution concept. So here is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Steve, Jonathan, and Alex, for three really clear, excellent presentations. I've got some questions, but I think I'll maybe open it up to CEM colleagues just to see if there's any questions or any thoughts coming through. Okay, nothing so far. So, yeah, quick question from me then, and I guess it's directed to you, Jonathan, just in terms of, I suppose, that kind of more practical aspect of mapping wilderness and naturalness. Does it matter whether we call something or we think about the concept that's kind of underpinning what you do as rewilding or free evolution?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Great. It's a great question. It's certainly something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you know, maybe a good way to think about it for me is the method, right? And so, in a way, for two key reasons, the definition is super important for A, what we see, and also B, how it's used. So, for example, with the development of CartNat, we spent an awful long time within this expert group inviting people with completely different disciplinary perspectives into this IUCN French group to think about, you know, what was the common ground. So obviously everybody's got these different perspectives, you know, and Steve's, you know, highlighted as well, you know, how the simplest way to represent that really is along a continuum. But ultimately, if you're going to kind of spatially represent something, you have to pick a point. And that spatial representation is a map, right, which is static. Then we have to pick a point on that continuum, even if we know that there are limitations for that. So, you know, we're forced in by the methods that we need to use for GIS and spatial mapping to pick a point on the continuum. But also for sort of political reasons, you know, having people agree where that point is super important as well. You know, so where we situate the map along that continuum helps us choose which spatial data we can, you know, use as a proxy to represent the definition. So in a way, we're forced to pick a point because of the spatial constraints. You know, we have to then say, okay, if we agree on the idea of naturalness, and that's this kind of slightly more neutral, relevant to the French context, works in French language, then we need to then think, you know, what are the spatial layers that can allow us to map that? And then secondly, you know, having that process having been a sort of participatory consultation process means that the map definition that we then represent is then owned by the people who were involved in making it. And of course, you know, as we know, if that map emerges as part of a sort of co-development process, then it has a greater chance of being taken up and used later on. Whilst if the map is a line drawn on the map by a privileged few, then it's more likely to lead to conflict.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was the point I made with the COP15 coming in Montreal. Target number 1 is very much pointing at that. There's a question in the chat there, Ian, from Arthur about how we deal with invasive species. Do you want to expand on that, Arthur, or is that a question as it stands? You're muted.
Yes, I think there are so many species, both recently invasive and earlier ones, that we're defining what nature is, particularly in a European context, where there's been so much activity for so many new generations, and often they crowd out and reduce a lot of what was naturally there originally. So they often seem to require some kind of intervention. So, you know, between leaving nature to do everything by itself and dealing with some of these invasives that are, you know, are in a sense destroying nature rather than contributing to it, and not part of what would have been the natural trophic lessons before, sort of raises that question. You know, is there a room to deal with invasives in certain contexts to allow something that's closer to what would be natural or richer in trophic levels than something that's become dominated by 1 or 2 invasives? Thank you.
Who wants to reply to that?
Well, I can say something about it, I suppose. Well, yeah, I think you know, rewilding happens at different levels. We've already heard sort of the word passive and active involved, and you know, active rewilding, there may be an initial requirement for some intervention to create the conditions whereby natural processes and species mix can you know, do their own thing. I'm about to give a lecture to my third year students, and we play a game in the lecture we call native, natural, wild. You know, and I ask them a question, show them some landscapes, and say, is it natural? Is it native? Is it wild? And some of those landscapes inevitably end up with non-native species in. but to quote a rewilding project near us, which involved removal of non-native conifer plantation, you cannot possibly get rid of it all, but you can take out the planted conifer. But what comes back after that is coming back as part of a natural process. But it's impossible to remove it entirely, but what comes back is growing naturally. So yeah, it's a tricky one. Where those non-native invasive species are particularly destructive and you can remove them, then yes, I would say go ahead and do it. But in other places, we might just have to say, well, hey, we're going to have to live with this. And there's an interesting book by Fred Pearce called The New Wild, where he just said, globalization has just enabled species which to migrate across the planet quicker than they would normally have done. So just because Sitka spruce isn't native to the UK doesn't mean to say that in 100,000, 500,000 years time it might rock up here anyway. We just allowed it to happen quicker. So yeah, I'm kind of in two minds about it.
Jonathan, Alex, any thoughts?
In French, you have some project we have the idea that if you let things going by itself in re-evolution project, the invasive species will be disappearing across the time because of the resilience capacity of the environment. But mostly is on large-scale projects and with a lot of time. I was thinking of a project we want to do that. It's the Francis Allais for the primary forest, and it's a project on several centuries. So at that scale, you have time to say, and maybe it will work that these things will just regulate by themselves.
One thing I might just add as well, in the French context is something we didn't have a chance to mention, but on the back of the mapping project in France that I presented, and also on the back of this new initiative on libre évolution in France that Alex was presenting, we've got a couple of workshops coming up at the end or second half of March actually, that are hosted by the Conservatoire du Littoral in France, where in a way I think that question, Arthur, on invasive species would very much be on the table. So what we're doing basically is we're taking small extracts of the map that we can actually walk through during a day, and we're going to have 2 workshops in 2 different parts of France where we get together with a group of foresters and hunters and agricultural people and walk through the map and sort of ask the question, how does the map represent what you understand by naturalness? How could the map be made better in terms of representing what it's supposed to represent, and how might it be made more useful? And in that sense, yeah, factoring in things like invasive species, but also increasingly fire risk linked to rewilding, which is a big subject in France now after the summer of 2022 when there was huge fires. Those will be the kinds of data questions, but also practical questions that we'll try and confront the map with at the local scale in the next few months.
There was a question from Rich, I think in the chat a bit earlier, which I think you responded to in the chat, Steve, but it might be worth just talking that through for the rest of the CEM group. Rich, I don't know if you want to pose that question again, or if you've dropped off the chat.
Hi, Ian. No, I'm still here. Yeah, I was coincidentally just reading a new paper that was published yesterday, which talks about the different approaches and end goals of restoration and rewilding, and then begins to argue about whether these are actually complementary to each other in some circumstances, and there's a synergy that can be sought between them. So I did see your thoughts. Thanks, Steve. But yeah, just wondered if what you thought about that.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet. I just pulled it up when you mentioned it, so it's on the to read pile. But yeah, we're working on a paper at the moment with a few of us. I think Ian put a bit more expansive, Karen Nelson, George Gann, and others, chewing the fat over this one. But I would say that we did a little bit of work just picking people's brains on Twitter actually, about Venn diagram of restoration and rewilding and how the two rings overlap. but we came to the conclusion that all rewilding is restoration, but not all restoration is rewilding. Okay, like any other model, that's not perfect, but it tends to speak to what most people agree and think. But yeah, the goals are complementary. It's just that I think restoration, there are some defined goals to begin with. We're going to do this because we're going to use natural processes to achieve those end goals, whereas rewilding is a bit more laissez-faire and allowing nature to call the shots, which takes us back to non-native invasives and things. Rewilding ought to, in a way, surprise us with what develops and go, oh, we didn't think that was going to happen. They might be perceived as negative or positive depending on who you are, but yeah, it's an interesting one. So I look forward to reading the paper.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks. Yeah.
Can I ask? Go on, Steve. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say I'm going to have to drop off in 3 minutes because I've got a lecture at 12. It's only just down the corridor, but I am going to have to drop off. So I'll just when I go. So
we need to drop off at 1 anyway. So quick question to all three of you actually. Alex's last slide mentioned biosphere reserves, and I just wondered to what extent you think biosphere reserves kind of offer an opportunity to ground both elements of both concepts in a kind of more practical kind of protected area kind of way, and explore kind of where they could where they work. I guess biosphere reserves are about that matrixed approach to landscape management with core areas, but with buffers as well.
I think that's which is interesting in the biosphere reserve model. It's the link between the land management and local population. So maybe it's this thing that can help to implement a libre évolution project or rewilding project and such, because actually mostly the projects led in Europe are done in some areas by only few people, and they are not really working with local living people. And the Man and Biosphere Reserve is maybe making it possible if we adjust the project of the target of the biosphere reserves.
I think, it's actually quite an interesting initiative that's just beginning, is to kind of explore this idea of how the idea of rewilding would even fit into the idea of man in the biosphere as a design, which obviously is, by its definition is like a very anthropocentric sort of definition. But I think that actually it shows great potential if we can kind of agree on how we might go about exploring the idea of rewilding according to a set of guiding principles and using structured spatial representation of the type that we've shown here. Then actually, the network of man in the biospheres with this kind of three zone design actually may be a great way for us to try and get some of this long-term monitoring in place at scale in lots of different biogeographical regions, to allow us to kind of better understand the value of rewilding and maybe the differences between a passive strategy and an active strategy. Because of the difficulty of funding projects that last more than 3 or 5 years, which of course is the standard academic funding model, it's been quite hard to kind of get some proper long-term monitoring off the ground in a controlled way. And I really am sort of optimistic that with this initiative that we've managed to sort of kick off here in France, that we might be able to push forward with a sort of robust, repeatable method for examining rewilding within that network of protected areas, and that could actually give us some of that kind of key data that we're missing to sort of show why rewilding is so beneficial and scalable.
Yeah, I think we've got the basis for another seminar there, Jonathan, or workshop or something, definitely. Steve, I think you probably have to go now. Unless you, yeah, okay. So
no, yeah, I probably do. So thanks everyone, and thanks. I know Angela's on the call, so I think big shout out to Angela for asking Ian and I to kick this off in the first place. So back in 2000 and whenever it was, 16.
Yeah,
okay,
thanks, Angela.
Cheers,
and
everyone.
Thanks everyone for coming along this afternoon. Really good to see you all here. My plan is that we'll look to do a kind of seminar every month, so I'll be in touch with more details. But yeah, thanks ever so much, and particularly thanks to Jonathan, to Alex, and to Steve.
Thank you.
See you all next time.
Thanks for having us, Ian. Thank you.
See you. Bye.
Bye.